The scorching summer sun was already climbing high over the dusty plains when Eliza Collins watched her husband of 8 years throw the last of his belongings into his saddlebag and turn his back on her. "You're nothing but a burden," he spat, mounting his horse without a backward glance. "A barren woman ain't worth the trouble of feeding." Eliza stood in stunned silence outside their modest homestead in the Nebraska Territory, the year 1876 stretching before her like an endless desert. At 26, she never imagined she'd be abandoned on the frontier with winter just months away and nothing but a failing farm to her name. "Thomas, please," she called out, her voice catching on the dry prairie wind. "You can't just leave me here alone." But Thomas Collins didn't even slow his horse as he rode toward the horizon, his silhouette growing smaller until he disappeared completely, leaving nothing but a trail of dust in his wake. No goodbye, no promises to return, just cruel words that cut deeper than any knife. Eliza's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank to the hard, packed earth, the reality of her situation washing over her in waves. She had no family within 500 miles. The nearest town, Cottonwood Springs, was a full day's ride away, and the small homestead they'd built together over the years was barely producing enough to feed one person, let alone provide anything to trade. She didn't cry. The harsh realities of frontier life had long ago taught her that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she picked herself up, dusted off her faded calico dress, and assessed what remained. Thomas had taken the good horse, leaving behind only old Bessie, their aging mare. He'd also taken most of their money and ammunition, but had left the hunting rifle probably because he'd purchased a newer model last month. "Well, Bessie," Eliza said, patting the horse's neck, "looks like it's just you and me now." That night, Eliza slept fitfully, one hand always near the rifle beside her bed. The sound of coyotes in the distance kept her on edge until dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. She rose with the sun, as she always did, and set about her chores. Without Thomas, there was still the garden to tend, water to fetch, and livestock to care for. The small collection of chickens and their milk cow, Daisy, still needed attention regardless of her husband's absence. 3 days passed in this manner, with Eliza working from dawn till dusk just to maintain the homestead. Each night, exhaustion claimed her before loneliness could take hold. But on the 4th day, as she struggled to repair a section of fence that the wind had knocked down, reality set in. She couldn't do this alone, not indefinitely. She was contemplating her options when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach for the rifle leaning against the fence post. Squinting against the midday sun, she could make out a single rider approaching from the north. Not Thomas. This man sat differently in the saddle, with an easy confidence that Thomas had never possessed. As the rider drew closer, Eliza kept the rifle ready but not raised. Out here, hospitality could mean the difference between life and death, but caution was equally important for a woman alone. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and though he wore a pistol on his hip, his hands remained in plain sight. "Afternoon, madam," he called out, his voice deep and smooth as honey. "Name's Zachary Hayes. I was hoping I might trouble you for some water for my horse. Been riding since dawn." Eliza hesitated, assessing the man. He didn't have the look of an outlaw about him, and his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, was well cared for. After a moment, she nodded. "Water's by the barn. Help yourself." "Much obliged," he said, tipping his hat before dismounting with fluid grace. Eliza watched as he led his horse to the water trough, speaking softly to the animal as it drank. There was something gentle in the way he handled the stallion that eased her wariness slightly. "You're welcome to some water yourself," she offered, her parched throat reminding her of her own manners. "Got some in the house." Zachary's smile transformed his weather-worn face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "That's mighty kind of you, missus. Collins, Eliza Collins, Mrs. Collins, he repeated, following her at a respectful distance to the house. Inside, Eliza poured water from the ceramic pitcher into a cup and handed it to him, careful that their fingers didn't touch. "Thank you," he said, drinking deeply. When he'd finished, he looked around the sparse but tidy cabin. "You live here alone, Mrs. Collins?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Eliza straightened her spine. "My husband's away on business," she lied, the words bitter on her tongue. Something in Zachary's eyes told her he didn't believe her, but he nodded anyway. "Well, I couldn't help but notice that fence you were working on. Looks like quite a job for one person." "I can manage," Eliza said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Zachary set down the cup. "I'm sure you can, madam. But I've got nowhere particular to be for a few days, and I'd be happy to lend a hand before moving on, in exchange for a spot to make camp and maybe a meal or two." Eliza studied him. Common sense told her to send this stranger on his way. But the fence wouldn't fix itself, and there were a dozen other tasks she couldn't tackle alone. "Where are you headed?" she asked instead. "California, eventually, looking for work along the way." "What kind of work? Anything honest," he replied with a shrug. "I was a ranch hand down in Texas for years. Before that, I drove cattle. Can build just about anything that needs building, and I'm handy with horses." Eliza made her decision. The fence needs mending, and the barn roof has a leak that needs patching before the fall rains come. "If you can handle those, you're welcome to stay through the week. There's a lean-to behind the barn where you can sleep." Zachary's smile returned, warming his features. "Yes, madam, I'll get started on that fence right away." True to his word, Zachary worked until sunset, repairing not just the section of fence Eliza had been struggling with, but continuing on to strengthen the entire north line. When darkness fell, he returned to the house, removing his hat before approaching the door. "Fence is looking better," he reported. "I'll finish it tomorrow and take a look at that barn roof." Eliza nodded, suddenly aware of how her hair had come loose from its bun and how her dress was smudged with dirt. "I've made a stew," she said, gesturing to the pot hanging over the fire. "Least I could do." They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the occasional clink of spoons against bowls and the distant call of an owl. Zachary ate like a man who'd missed too many meals, though he maintained impeccable manners. "This is delicious, Mrs. Collins," he said when he'd finished. "Best meal I've had in months." Eliza felt a flush of pride at the simple compliment. "It's just rabbit stew." "Well, it's perfect rabbit stew," he insisted with that dimpled smile. After dinner, Zachary excused himself to tend to his horse and set up his bedroll in the lean-to. Eliza watched from the window as he moved about in the moonlight, his movements efficient and purposeful. For the first time in days, she felt the knot of anxiety in her chest loosen slightly. Morning came with the crowing of the rooster, and Eliza rose to start her day. To her surprise, when she stepped outside to fetch water from the well, she found the bucket already filled and waiting by the door. From the direction of the barn came the sound of hammering. Zachary had been up before dawn, it seemed, and was already at work on the barn roof. Eliza carried the water inside and set about making breakfast, deciding that a man working that hard deserved more than cold biscuits. By the time she had a simple meal of cornmeal mush, eggs, and bacon prepared, Zachary appeared at the door, his shirt damp with honest sweat. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," he greeted her, his voice cheerful despite the early hour. "Hope you don't mind, but I collected some eggs while I was checking on that roof." "I see that," she replied, nodding to the plate of food she'd set out for him, "and I appreciate it. Please eat while it's hot." Zachary washed his hands in the basin by the door before sitting down to eat. "You didn't have to cook for me," he said, though his eyes lit up at the sight of the food. "Seems fair. You're doing the work of two men out there." "Just doing what needs doing," he said simply, tucking into his breakfast with appreciation. The day passed in a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Eliza tended to her garden and chickens, prepared meals, and worked on mending clothes, while Zachary repaired the fence, patched the barn roof, and even took it upon himself to chop a substantial pile of firewood. By the third day of this arrangement, Eliza found herself watching Zachary as he worked, admiring the strength in his arms as he swung the axe, the way the sun glinted off his sandy brown hair, and how his smile seemed to appear so readily whenever their paths crossed. It was on the fourth day that the storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering on the horizon with alarming speed. Eliza was hanging laundry when the first distant rumble of thunder reached her ears. "Better get that inside," Zachary called from where he was reinforcing the chicken coop. "Looks like we're in for a big one." Together, they rushed to secure the homestead, bringing in the laundry, ensuring the animals were safely in the barn, and battening down anything that might blow away in the coming wind. They had just made it back to the house when the skies opened up, rain coming down in sheets that turned the yard into a muddy river within minutes. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that made the windows rattle. "That's directly overhead," Zachary observed, peering out the window at the deluge. "Good thing we got everything secured when we did." Eliza nodded, trying not to show her relief at not having to face the storm alone. Thomas had always been irritable during bad weather, complaining about lost work time and pacing like a caged animal. Zachary, by contrast, seemed perfectly at ease. "Well, since we're stuck inside," he said, turning away from the window, "is there anything I can help with in here?" Eliza glanced around the small cabin. "Actually, there's a loose floorboard by the table that's been catching at my skirts, if you wouldn't mind." "Not at all," Zachary replied, already looking for the problem spot. They passed the afternoon with indoor tasks, Zachary fixing not just the floorboard but a wobbly chair and a sticking drawer in the kitchen cabinet, while Eliza baked bread and prepared a more elaborate dinner than usual, grateful for the company. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Wind howled around the eaves of the house, and rain continued to pound against the roof and windows. "I should head back to the lean-to," Zachary said after they'd finished eating, though he made no move to leave the warmth of the cabin. Eliza looked toward the window, where water streamed down the glass in rivulets. "Don't be ridiculous. You'll drown just crossing the yard." "You can sleep by the fire tonight." Zachary's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "If you're sure, Mrs. Collins." "I'm sure," she said firmly, "and you can call me Eliza. Seems silly to stand on formality after you've fixed half my house." His smile was warm and genuine. "Eliza, then." "And I'm Zach to my friends." Friends. The word hung between them, simple yet significant. Eliza couldn't remember the last time she'd had a friend. Thomas had always discouraged visitors, preferring their isolation. As the night deepened, they sat by the fire, the storm creating a cocoon of sound around the small cabin. Zach told her stories of his travels, of cattle drives and the characters he'd met along the way. Eliza found herself laughing more than she had in years. "What about you?" he asked eventually. "Have you always lived in Nebraska Territory?" Eliza's smile faded slightly. "No, I grew up in Missouri, met Thomas when I was 17. He had big dreams about homesteading out west, building something of our own." She stared into the fire. "Turns out dreams and reality don't always match up." Zach was quiet for a moment. "Your husband, he's not coming back, is he?" The direct question caught her off guard, but there was no judgment in his tone, only gentle understanding. Eliza shook her head. "No, he left 8 days ago." "Said I was a burden." The word still stung, even saying it aloud. "Then he's a fool," Zach said simply, his blue eyes meeting hers across the firelight. Eliza looked away first, her heart beating a strange rhythm in her chest. "It's late," she said, rising from her chair. "I'll get you some blankets for the floor." That night, lying in her bed with Zach sleeping just a few feet away by the dying embers of the fire, Eliza found herself more awake than she'd been in years. Every small sound, his steady breathing, the occasional shift of his body seemed amplified in the darkness. It wasn't fear that kept her awake, she realized with surprise. It was awareness. Morning broke with clearing skies and a world washed clean by the storm. Eliza rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to find the cabin empty. For a moment, a cold fear gripped her had Zach left without saying goodbye. But then the door opened, and there he was, arms laden with wood for the fire, his hair damp from the lingering rain. "Morning," he greeted her with a smile. "Thought I'd get a fire going. It's chilly after that storm." Relief washed over her, followed immediately by embarrassment at her reaction. Of course he hadn't left. His horse was still in the barn, his few possessions still neatly stacked by the door. "Thank you," she said, turning to hide her flushed cheeks as she reached for the coffee pot. "I'll have breakfast ready soon." As she prepared the meal, she couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to have him moving about the cabin, building up the fire, setting the table without being asked. Thomas had never helped with such things. Considering them women's work beneath his dignity over breakfast, Zach outlined his plans for the day, checking for storm damage, clearing any debris, and finishing the repairs to the chicken coop. Eliza nodded, adding her own tasks to the list, and they fell into an easy conversation about the work ahead. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that Zach broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "I promised to stay the week to help with repairs," he said, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "That's 3 more days, but after that." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "What will you do, Eliza? Winter's coming, and running this place alone won't be easy." The question hung between them, practical yet loaded with unspoken concerns. Eliza had been asking herself the same thing since Thomas rode away. "I've been thinking about selling," she admitted. "Moving back east, maybe, but I don't know if anyone would buy this place, remote as it is. And I don't have enough money to start over somewhere else," she sighed. "For now, I'm just trying to get through each day." Zach nodded, his expression thoughtful. "There's another option," he said carefully. "I could stay longer, help you get ready for winter at least, if you want." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "You said you were headed to California." "California's been there a long time," he replied with a slight smile. "It'll still be there come spring." The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying all at once. Having Zach stay would solve her immediate problems. She'd have help with the heavy work, protection from the dangers that lurked on the frontier, and company through the long winter months. But it also presented new complications that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "I couldn't ask you to do that," she said finally. "It's too much." "You didn't ask, I offered." His eyes held hers, steady and sincere. "But I understand if you'd rather I move on." Eliza looked away, her thoughts in turmoil. "Let me think about it," she said at last. "We still have 3 days to decide." Zach nodded, accepting her non-answer without pressing further. "Fair enough. In the meantime, I'd better check on that chicken coop. Those hens won't lay if they're getting rained on." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. The storm had caused more damage than initially apparent. A section of the garden fence had been flattened by a fallen branch. The path to the well was washed out, and water had seeped into the root cellar, threatening the stores they'd need for winter. Zach tackled each problem with quiet competence, working from sunrise to sunset with barely a break. Eliza worked alongside him when she could, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools or steadied a piece of wood, each brief contact sending a jolt of awareness through her that she tried desperately to ignore. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in a comfortable silence that Eliza had never experienced with Thomas. Zach told her more about his life growing up on a small farm in Kentucky, losing his parents to fever when he was 19, drifting west in search of purpose more than fortune. "Never quite found a place that felt like home," he admitted on the eve of what was supposed to be his last night at the homestead. "Always thought I'd know it when I found it, but maybe that's not how it works." Eliza watched the firelight play across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the thoughtful set of his mouth. "How does it work, then?" His eyes met hers, reflecting the dancing flames. Maybe home isn't a place at all, maybe it's people, the right people. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that neither was ready to acknowledge directly. Eliza looked away first, her heart hammering in her chest. "It's late," she said, rising from her chair. "We both need rest." Zach nodded, accepting the gentle deflection. "Good night, Eliza." "Good night, Zach." In her bed that night, Eliza lay awake long after Zach's breathing had evened out into sleep. Tomorrow he would leave, unless she asked him to stay. The practical side of her knew that having his help through winter would greatly increase her chances of survival. But there was another side, a side she'd buried deep during her years with Thomas that recognized the danger in allowing Zach to remain. Because it wasn't just his skills or his protection she'd come to value over the past week. It was his laughter, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious rather than a burden. It was the man himself, and that realization terrified her more than the prospect of facing winter alone. Dawn arrived with a heavy dew that sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Eliza rose early, determined to face the day with clear-headed practicality. She had a proposition to offer Zach, one that would benefit them both without complicating matters unnecessarily. She found him already outside, checking the cinches on his saddle, preparing for departure. The sight sent an unexpected pang through her chest. "Morning," she called, approaching with measured steps. Zach turned, his expression warming at the sight of her. "Morning, Eliza." "I was just getting ready to, I'd like you to stay," she interrupted, the words tumbling out before she could arrange them more carefully. "Through winter, I mean, as a business arrangement." His hands stilled on the saddle. "A business arrangement." Eliza nodded, clasping her hands to stop them from fidgeting. "Room and board in exchange for help with the homestead, plus a share of whatever we can sell at market come spring." She took a deep breath. "It makes sense for both of us. You need somewhere to winter and I need the help." Zach studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes unreadable. "A strictly business arrangement," he clarified. "Yes." Eliza lifted her chin. Nothing more. Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or relief before he nodded. "All right then. I accept your offer, Mrs. Collins." The formality stung more than it should have. "Good," she said, matching his tone. "We should discuss the specifics of the arrangement, what needs to be done before winter, division of responsibilities, that sort of thing." "Of course." Zach began to unsaddle his horse. "After breakfast." "After breakfast," she agreed, turning back toward the house, unsure if she felt relieved or disappointed by his easy acceptance of her terms. Breakfast was a quieter affair than it had been in days past, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they'd finished eating that Zach broke the silence. "So, what are the most pressing concerns for winter preparation?" Eliza pushed her plate aside, grateful for the return to practical matters. "Firewood is the biggest one. We'll need at least 3 times what's currently stacked. The garden needs harvesting and preserving. The root cellar needs to be thoroughly dried out and restocked, and the north wall of the barn has a draft that needs sealing before the first snow." Zach nodded, mentally cataloging the tasks. "The horse shed could use reinforcement too. And we should check the cabin roof. That storm might have loosened some shingles." Eliza questioned, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not much use on a roof." "You'd be surprised what you can do when someone shows you how," Zach replied with a hint of his usual smile. "But fair enough. I'll handle the roofing. What about hunting? I noticed the smokehouse is nearly empty." "Thomas usually did the hunting," Eliza admitted. "I can shoot, but I'm not particularly good at tracking." "I am," Zach said simply. "We'll need deer, maybe an elk if we're lucky. Smoked meat will get us through the worst of winter." They continued planning, dividing tasks according to skill and necessity, the initial awkwardness gradually giving way to the easy cooperation they'd established over the past week. By the time they'd finished, Eliza felt a sense of cautious optimism about the months ahead. With Zach's help, they might not just survive the winter but emerge in spring with a more prosperous homestead than she'd ever managed with Thomas. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm up at dawn, breakfast together, then to their separate tasks until dinner, when they would report on progress and plan for the next day. They worked hard, often too exhausted by nightfall for more than a brief conversation before sleep claimed them. But as September gave way to October, and the first hints of autumn chill crept into the air, something else was growing alongside their winter preparations. Eliza found herself watching Zach when he wasn't looking the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he chopped wood, the gentleness of his hands when he helped deliver a calf, the quiet concentration on his face as he repaired her mother's rocking chair that had been broken for years. And sometimes, when she looked up suddenly, she would catch him watching her too, his gaze quickly shifting away when their eyes met. They maintained their careful distance, physical and emotional. Zach still slept in the lean-to behind the barn, coming to the cabin only for meals and planning. Eliza kept her conversations practical, avoiding the personal exchanges that had characterized their earlier evenings by the fire. It was safer this way, she told herself. Simpler. She'd been burned once by giving her heart too freely. She wouldn't make that mistake again. But then came the day that changed everything. Eliza was in the garden, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables before the first frost could claim them, when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Setting down her basket, she straightened, shading her eyes against the midday sun. 3 men on horseback were approaching from the east, riding hard toward the homestead. They weren't travelers seeking hospitality, their purposeful pace, and the rifles visible in their saddle holsters made that clear enough. Fear gripped Eliza's throat. Zach had ridden out at dawn to check trap lines in the forest to the west. She was alone. Quickly, she moved toward the cabin where the rifle waited above the door, but she'd barely made it halfway across the yard when the riders thundered up, cutting off her path. "Well, well," the lead rider drawled, reining his horse to a stop mere feet from her. "What have we here? A pretty little thing all alone in the middle of nowhere." Eliza stood her ground, though her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "This is private property." "State your business or move on." The man laughed, a harsh sound that sent shivers down her spine. He was older than the others, with a gray-streaked beard and cold eyes that assessed her like she was livestock at auction. "Heard tell that Thomas Collins abandoned his claim," he said. "Thought we'd come see if it was true. Looks like it is." Ice flooded Eliza's veins. These men knew Thomas, and they knew he was gone. "My husband is due back any day now," she lied, forcing steel into her voice. "And this land is legally registered in both our names. It's not abandoned." The leader exchanged glances with his companion's younger men with matching sneers and hungry eyes. "That right. Cause word in town is Thomas Collins took up with a saloon girl in Cottonwood Springs and ain't planning to come back to his barren wife." He spat the word like it was filth in his mouth. Humiliation burned through Eliza, hot and sickening. Thomas had not only abandoned her but had made sure everyone knew why. "My domestic situation is none of your concern," she managed, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Now I'll ask you once more to leave my property." Instead of complying, the leader dismounted, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Thing is, Mrs. Collins, abandoned land reverts to public domain, and me and my boys here, we've been looking for a nice piece of property just like this one." He took a step toward her. "Of course we might be persuaded to let you stay on, if you make it worth our while." Eliza backed away, her mind racing. The rifle was still in the cabin. Even if she could reach it, she was outnumbered 3-1. Her only hope was to stall until Zach returned. "The land isn't abandoned," she insisted. "I have a partner now. He's just gone hunting for the day." The men laughed in unison, clearly not believing her. "A partner, is it?" the leader mocked. "Funny we ain't seen no man's tracks around here except our own." That was because Zach had left before dawn, riding west where the ground was rocky and left few prints. But Eliza didn't bother explaining this. Instead, she continued backing toward the cabin, hoping to reach the door before they realized her intent. She almost made it. Her hand was reaching for the latch when rough fingers closed around her arm, yanking her back. "Where do you think you're going?" the leader growled, his breath hot on her face. "We ain't finished talking business. Let her go." The voice came from behind them, quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. All four of them turned to see Zach standing at the edge of the yard, rifle raised and aimed squarely at the leader's chest. Relief flooded through Eliza so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Zach had come back early. He must have spotted the riders from a distance and circled around to approach undetected. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," the leader said, though his grip on Eliza's arm loosened slightly. "This is between us and the widow Collins here." "She's not a widow," Zach replied evenly, his aim never wavering. "And she's not alone. Now take your hands off her, mount up, and ride out while you still can." For a tense moment, no one moved. The leader's companions had their hands hovering near their own weapons, but Zach had the advantage of an already aimed rifle. Finally, the leader released Eliza's arm and stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "No need for bloodshed," he said. "We were just having a friendly conversation." "Didn't look friendly from where I'm standing," Zach replied coldly. "Now go." The leader mounted his horse, his eyes never leaving Zach. "This isn't over," he warned. "Collins' land's been claimed by my boys for years. Just waiting for that fool Thomas to give up and move on." "Then you'll be waiting a good while longer," Zach said. "Because this land belongs to Mrs. Collins, and as long as I'm here, no one's taking it from her." With a final venomous glare, the leader signaled to his companions, and they wheeled their horses around, galloping away in a cloud of dust. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Zach lower his rifle and cross quickly to Eliza's side. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "No," she assured him, though her voice trembled slightly. "They didn't. They just threatened." Relief washed over his features, followed immediately by anger. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "Men like that don't give up easily." "Who were they?" Eliza asked, suddenly aware that she was shaking. "Jed Maxwell and his sons," Zach replied, guiding her gently toward the cabin. "They have a reputation even down in Texas. They've been squatting on unclaimed land throughout the territory, intimidating legitimate homesteaders into abandoning their claims." Inside the cabin, Zach set his rifle by the door and moved to stoke the fire, which had burned low during his absence. Eliza sank into a chair, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her drained. "You're back early," she observed, watching as he worked. "I thought you'd be gone until evening." "Caught 2 rabbits in the first hour and decided to try my luck closer to home," he explained, straightening once the fire was crackling properly. "Good thing I did." "Yes," Eliza agreed softly. "Good thing." Zach turned to face her, his expression grave. "Eliza, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did Thomas abandon this land legally? Did he file paperwork relinquishing his claim?" Eliza frowned, considering the question. "I don't think so. He left in a hurry, took only what he could carry on horseback." "I don't believe he would have gone all the way to the land office first." Zach nodded, relief visible in the set of his shoulders. "Then the claim is still valid, especially with you living here and working the land. But those men will be looking for any legal loophole they can find." "What should we do?" Eliza asked, her practical nature reasserting itself as the initial shock faded. "First, I think I should move into the cabin," Zach said carefully, watching her reaction. "Just to sleep. The lean-to is too far away if they come back at night." Eliza nodded, knowing he was right. Having Zach closer would be safer for both of them. "And then one of us needs to ride to town, check with the land office to make sure the claim is still valid, and let the sheriff know about Maxwell's threats." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "I'd go myself, but I don't like the idea of leaving you alone, even for a day." "We could go together," Eliza suggested. "Close up the house, take the animals to the Wilsons' farm to the south." They've helped me before when Thomas was away on longer trips. Zach considered this, then nodded. That might be best. We can leave at first light tomorrow, be in Cottonwood Springs by midday. The decision made, they set about preparing for the journey, packing provisions, securing the homestead as best they could, and planning what to say to the land office clerk and sheriff. Through it all, Eliza was acutely aware of a shift in their dynamic. The careful distance they'd maintained had been breached by necessity, and neither seemed inclined to rebuild it. That night, as promised, Zach made his bed by the fire in the main room of the cabin. Eliza, in her small bedroom just off the main living area, lay awake listening to the soft sounds of his movements as he settled in for the night. "Zach," she called softly through the partially open door. "Yes." His voice came back immediately, suggesting he too was still awake. "Thank you for coming back when you did today." There was a pause then. "I'll always come back, Eliza." The simple promise settled around her heart like a warm blanket, comforting and dangerous all at once. Because despite her best efforts to maintain their business arrangement, Eliza was beginning to realize that her feelings for Zachary Hayes had long since transcended the merely practical. The journey to Cottonwood Springs the next day was tense but uneventful. They had risen before dawn to load the wagon with the few valuables they couldn't bear to leave behind, then driven the livestock to the Wilson farm 2 miles south. Mrs. Wilson, a kind-faced woman with steel in her spine, had accepted the animals without question and promised to watch over them until Eliza's return. "And you'll be staying with your partner in town?" Mrs. Wilson had asked, her eyes moving speculatively between Eliza and Zach. "We'll be getting rooms at the hotel," Eliza replied firmly, ignoring the knowing look in the older woman's eyes. "Just until we sort out some business with the land office." Now, as they approached the outskirts of Cottonwood Springs, Eliza felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. She hadn't been to town in nearly 3 months, not since Thomas had made the trip for supplies in July. The prospect of facing people who might have heard about her abandonment made her stomach clench with dread. As if sensing her thoughts, Zach reached across the wagon seat to briefly touch her hand. "Remember, we're here for information and legal protection," he said quietly. "Nothing else matters." Eliza nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. Together they rode into town, the wagon wheels raising small clouds of dust on the main street. Cottonwood Springs was a modest settlement, boasting a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, a church, and various other businesses necessary for frontier life. The land office doubled as the post office, a square building with a wide porch situated near the center of town. Zach guided the wagon to a hitching post outside the hotel. "Let's secure rooms first," he suggested. "Then we can visit the land office before it closes for the day." Eliza agreed, though her eyes were drawn to the saloon across the street. Was Thomas's new woman in there? Did the whole town know of her humiliation inside the hotel? A thin man with spectacles regarded them with mild interest. "Room for the night?" he inquired, reaching for the register. "2 rooms," Zach specified. "Adjoining if possible." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment as he checked his book. "Got 2 rooms at the end of the hall upstairs. They share a connecting door if that suits." "That's fine," Zach said, placing money on the counter. "We'll also need to stable our horses and secure our wagon overnight." Business concluded, they made their way to the land office, where a harried clerk confirmed that Thomas Collins had not filed any paperwork relinquishing his claim to the homestead. "According to our records, the land is still registered jointly to Thomas and Eliza Collins," the man explained, adjusting his spectacles as he peered at the ledger. "Has been since 1869. Relief flooded through Eliza. "And if my husband has abandoned the property, does the claim remain valid if I continue to work the land?" The clerk looked up, his expression softening slightly at the question. "Yes, madam. As long as one legal claimant maintains residence and continues improvements on the property, the claim remains valid. After 7 years of continuous residence, you can file for the patent, making the land yours outright. And what about her partner? Zach asked. If I'm helping work the land, does that strengthen or weaken the claim? The clerk considered this. Having help doesn't weaken the claim at all. In fact, continued improvements strengthen it, but if you're asking about legal rights to the property. He hesitated. That's more complicated. Without proper documentation, you wouldn't have any legal claim to the land itself. Zach nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. Thank you for your time. Their next stop was the sheriff's office, a small building adjacent to the town jail. Sheriff Miller was a burly man with a thick mustache and weary eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He listened carefully as they explained about the Maxwells' visit and threats. Can't say I'm surprised, he sighed when they'd finished. Jed Maxwell's been a thorn in my side for years. Him and those boys of his think they can intimidate honest folks out of their rightful claims. He stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Problem is, unless they actually commit a crime, there's not much I can do. Threatening a woman alone on her homestead isn't a crime, Zach asked, an edge to his voice. Sheriff Miller held up a placating hand. It is, but without witnesses besides the two of you, it's your word against theirs. And the Maxwells have friends in these parts. He leaned forward. That said, I'll ride out to their place, have a word. Let them know I'm keeping an eye on the situation. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down. It wasn't the decisive action they'd hoped for, but it was better than nothing. They thanked the sheriff for his time and stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun slanting low across the buildings. Well, that's done, Zach said, his hand resting lightly at the small of Eliza's back as they navigated the busy sidewalk. How about some dinner? You must be hungry after the day we've had. Eliza was about to agree when a familiar figure emerged from the saloon across the street. Thomas, her husband, former husband. She wasn't sure what to call him now. He hadn't seen them yet, his attention focused on buttoning his coat against the October chill. Zach followed her gaze, his body tensing beside her. Is that him? He asked quietly. Eliza nodded, unable to find her voice as a storm of emotions swept through her: anger, hurt, humiliation, and surprisingly, a distant sort of pity. Thomas looked thinner than she remembered, his once handsome face now haggard and lined. You want to speak to him? Zach asked, his tone carefully neutral. Eliza considered the question. Part of her wanted to confront Thomas, to demand answers for his cruel abandonment. But another part, a stronger part, recognized that nothing he could say would heal the wounds he'd inflicted. No, she said finally. There's nothing to say that would change anything. Zach's approval was evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. Let's go to the hotel dining room then, it's on the other side of town. They had turned to leave when Thomas looked up and spotted them. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness as his gaze moved from Eliza to the tall man at her side. Eliza, he called, crossing the street toward them. What are you doing in town? Eliza straightened her spine, grateful for Zach's solid presence beside her. Business at the land office, she replied coolly. Nothing that concerns you. Thomas's eyes narrowed, focusing on Zach. And who's this? Zachary Hayes, Zach introduced himself, offering no explanation of his relationship to Eliza. You must be Thomas Collins. Thomas ignored the unspoken question, his attention returning to Eliza. You selling the homestead? He demanded. Because if you are, I'm entitled to half of whatever you get for it. Anger flared hot in Eliza's chest. Entitled, she repeated incredulously. You abandoned me, Thomas, left me alone with nothing but cruel words and a failing farm. You have no entitlement to anything. A flush crept up Thomas's neck. That land is half mine legally. And you're welcome to come back and work it, Eliza retorted, surprising herself with her boldness. But we both know you won't. You made your choice 8 weeks ago when you rode away. I'm making mine now. Thomas's gaze shifted to Zach, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So that's how it is," he said with a sneer. "Didn't take you long to find a replacement, did it?" Before Eliza could respond, Zach stepped forward, his expression dangerously calm. "Mr. Collins, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Something in Zach's tone or stance must have registered as a genuine threat, because Thomas took an involuntary step backward. "Keep the damn farm," he muttered. "It was never worth the trouble anyway." With that, he turned and stalked back toward the saloon, shoulders hunched defensively. Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Well," she said with forced lightness, "that was unpleasant but surprisingly easy." Zach's expression remained grim. "He'll be back," he predicted. "Men like that can't stand to think someone else might succeed where they failed." "Then we'll deal with him when he comes," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. "For now, I believe you mentioned dinner." The hotel dining room was quiet, with only a few other patrons scattered among the tables. They were shown to a corner table, where a tired-looking waitress took their order before disappearing into the kitchen. Alone for the first time since their encounter with Thomas, Eliza found herself unexpectedly shy. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing with me back there." Zach's expression softened. "You didn't need my help. You handled him perfectly on your own. Still, it was nice to have you there." She traced a pattern on the tablecloth with her finger. "Zach, when we get back to the homestead, things will be different now." "How so?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Eliza met his gaze directly. "The Maxwells will be watching us. Thomas knows about you now. People in town will talk. Our arrangement won't be seen as merely business anymore." "Does that bother you?" Zach's question was gentle, probing. Eliza considered it honestly. Did it bother her that people would assume she and Zach were more than business partners? That they might whisper about impropriety or scandal? A few months ago it would have, but now? "No," she admitted finally. "It doesn't bother me at all." Something warmed in Zach's blue eyes. "It doesn't bother me either." The simple exchange hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities as their dinner arrived. They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. After dinner, they retired to their adjoining rooms, the connecting door left slightly ajar by mutual unspoken agreement. Eliza prepared for bed, hyper-aware of Zach moving about in the next room, the familiar sound somehow more intimate in these new surroundings. Sleep eluded her as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, her mind replaying the day's events, the confirmation that her claim was secure, the sheriff's promise to speak to the Maxwells, the unexpected encounter with Thomas, and most of all, the shifting dynamic between her and Zach. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke with a start to the sound of raised voices from the street below. Disoriented, she sat up, trying to make sense of the commotion. "Fire!" someone was shouting. "Fire at the livery stable!" Eliza was out of bed in an instant, rushing to the window. In the distance, orange flames were visible, lighting the night sky with an ominous glow. The livery stable where their horses and wagon were housed. Before she could react, the connecting door pushed open fully and Zach appeared, already dressed. "Stay here," he instructed, grabbing his hat. "I'll check on our horses." "I'm coming with you," Eliza insisted, reaching for her dress. Zach hesitated, then nodded. "Be quick." They hurried downstairs and out into the street, where townspeople were rushing toward the burning stable, forming a bucket brigade from the town well. The smell of smoke hung thick in the air, and in the distance, horses could be heard whinnying in panic. As they neared the scene, Eliza's heart sank. The fire had engulfed the entire eastern side of the stable, and men were struggling to lead frightened horses from the western side before the flames spread. "Our horses were on the east side," Zach muttered, breaking into a run. They reached the edge of the crowd just as a portion of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. The heat was intense, driving people back from the building. "Anybody still inside?" The livery owner was shouting, his face streaked with soot. "We got all the horses out from the west side," someone called back. "East side was already gone when we got here." Eliza felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Their horses, their wagon, everything they'd brought from the homestead, all gone. Zach's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as they watched the building burn. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked in a low voice. Eliza nodded grimly. "This wasn't an accident, no," Zach agreed. "Either Thomas or the Maxwells, maybe both." They stood in silence as the bucket brigade fought a losing battle against the flames. By dawn, all that remained of the livery stable was a smoldering skeleton of charred timber and ash. The livery owner, a man named Peterson, approached them as they stood surveying the destruction. "Mr. Hayes." "Mrs. Collins, I'm sorry about your animals and wagon. Nothing we could do." "We understand," Zach assured him. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, thank God, lost 4 horses and 2 wagons, including yours." Peterson wiped his sooty face with a handkerchief. "Sheriff saying it was likely a lantern knocked over, but—" He lowered his voice. "Between us, I don't believe it. Someone broke the lock on the east door, found the pieces this morning." Eliza and Zach exchanged glances, their suspicions confirmed. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Zach asked carefully. Peterson shrugged. "Could be anyone. But I did see Jed Maxwell's boys in town yesterday, drinking heavy at the saloon, and your husband was there too, Mrs. Collins. Heard he was asking questions about you too." The implications were clear. Either Thomas or the Maxwells or both working together had targeted them specifically. "What now?" Eliza asked as Peterson moved away to speak with the sheriff. "We can't get back to the homestead without horses." Zach's expression was grim but determined. "We'll figure something out. First, let's talk to the sheriff again. Make sure he knows this wasn't an accident." Sheriff Miller was sympathetic but frustratingly cautious. "I understand your suspicions," he said after hearing them out, "but I can't arrest someone on speculation alone." "Need evidence, witnesses." "So they just get away with it?" Eliza asked, anger edging her voice. The sheriff sighed. "For now, yes, but I'll keep my eyes open, and I'll have a word with both Thomas Collins and the Maxwell boys." He leaned forward. "In the meantime, I'd advise you to be careful. If someone's targeting you, they might not stop at burning a stable." It was cold comfort, but at least the sheriff was taking their concerns seriously now. As they left his office, Zach placed a protective hand at the small of Eliza's back. "We need to get back to the homestead," he said quietly. "Sooner rather than later." Eliza nodded, her thoughts racing ahead. "We could buy new horses, but that would take most of our money, and we'd still need a wagon." "I might have another solution," Zach said thoughtfully. "Wait here." He left her on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and crossed the street to the general store. Through the window, Eliza watched as he engaged the proprietor in conversation, gesturing occasionally in a way that suggested negotiation. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, Zach emerged from the store with a satisfied expression. "Good news," he announced as he rejoined her. "Mr. Jenkins in there has a wagon and team he's willing to sell us at a fair price. He's also agreed to extend credit for supplies we'll need: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition. Says he's known you since you first came to the territory and trusts you're good for it." Relief washed over Eliza. That's wonderful news." "There's more," Zach continued as they began walking back toward the hotel. "Jenkins mentioned that a cattle drive is passing near Cottonwood Springs tomorrow, headed for the railroad at Grand Island. The trail boss is an old acquaintance of mine from Texas. If we can catch up to them, we might be able to arrange an escort back to the homestead." Hope bloomed in Eliza's chest. A cattle drive meant cowboys, men with guns who could deter the Maxwells if they tried to cause trouble. "Do you think your friend would agree to that?" "For a price, yes." "Cattle drives always need extra money for supplies." Zach's expression turned serious. "But Eliza, we need to be realistic. Even with an escort, we're returning to a dangerous situation. The Maxwells won't give up easily, and now they might have Thomas helping them. Eliza straightened her spine. I'm not giving up my home, Zach, not after everything I've put into it. Zach's slow smile warmed her from the inside out. I was hoping you'd say that. They spent the remainder of the day making preparations, purchasing the wagon and team from Jenkins, stocking up on supplies, and retrieving their few belongings from the hotel. By nightfall, they were ready to depart at first light to intercept the cattle drive. That night, in their adjoining hotel rooms, Eliza found sleep even more elusive than before. The events of the day had left her wired with a strange mixture of anxiety and determination. When a soft knock came at the connecting door, she wasn't surprised. "Come in," she called, sitting up in bed. Zach entered, still fully dressed, his expression troubled. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what happens after we get back to the homestead." Eliza pulled her blanket higher, suddenly conscious of her nightgown. "What do you mean?" He paced the small room, uncharacteristically agitated. "The Maxwells won't stop, not until they get what they want or are forced to back down permanently." He ran a hand through his hair. "And I can't. I won't leave you to face them alone." "I know," Eliza said softly. "I never thought you would." Zach stopped pacing, turning to face her directly. "What I'm trying to say, Eliza, is that our business arrangement isn't going to be enough anymore, not for the challenges ahead, and not for—" He hesitated, seeming to search for words. "Not for what?" She prompted, her heart hammering in her chest. "Not for what I feel for you," he finished simply. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Eliza found herself speechless, 1,000 emotions colliding within her. Zach moved to sit on the edge of her bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I didn't plan this," he continued when she remained silent. "When I stopped at your homestead that day, I was just a drifter looking for water and maybe a meal, but then I met you. And nothing has been the same since." Eliza found her voice at last. "Zach, you don't have to say anything now," he interrupted gently. "I know this is sudden and you've been through so much. I just needed you to know where I stand before we ride back into whatever's waiting for us at the homestead." The sincerity in his eyes undid her final reservations. "It's not sudden," she whispered. "Not for me. I think I've known since that first storm when you stayed in the cabin and made me laugh for the first time in years." Zach's expression transformed, hope and joy replacing uncertainty. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. When his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, Eliza felt something inside her shift and settle, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted. "The homestead, the Maxwells, Thomas, there's so much uncertainty." "There always will be," Zach replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "That's life on the frontier, but whatever comes, we'll face it together if you'll have me." Eliza's answer was to lean forward and press her lips to his, a kiss as gentle as a whisper and as profound as a promise. When they parted, both were smiling. "Together, then," she agreed. Dawn found them on the road, the newly purchased wagon loaded with supplies, heading east to intercept the cattle drive. They traveled in comfortable silence, the previous night's confession having transformed their relationship in ways both subtle and profound. Around midday, they spotted the dust cloud on the horizon that signaled the approaching herd. Zach guided their wagon to a small rise overlooking the trail, where they waited for the cattle to draw near. The sight was impressive, nearly 2,000 longhorns moving like a living river across the plains, guided by a dozen cowboys on horseback. At the head of the procession rode a weathered man in a battered hat, who Zach identified as his old acquaintance, trail boss Jacob Wheeler. When the lead riders were within hailing distance, Zach stood in the wagon and waved his hat. The trail boss spotted them and raised a hand in acknowledgement, directing his horse toward their position while signaling for the drive to continue. "Zachary Hayes," Wheeler called as he approached, a grin splitting his bearded face. "Heard you'd gone respectable." Zach laughed, jumping down from the wagon to shake the man's hand. "Not quite, Jacob, just found a place worth staying for a while." Wheeler's shrewd eyes moved to Eliza, who remained seated in the wagon. "Madam," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Jacob Wheeler, at your service." Introductions and pleasantries were exchanged before Zach explained their situation, the homestead, the threats from the Maxwells, and their need for an escort. Wheeler stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Jed Maxwell," he mused. "Nasty piece of work. Tried to extort protection money from a cattle drive I ran through here 2 years back." His expression hardened. "Let's just say he didn't get what he wanted then, and I'd be happy to disappoint him again." Relief washed over Eliza. "You'll help us then?" For Zach here, absolutely. Wheeler glanced back at his herd. "We're making good time, ahead of schedule for our delivery to the railroad. I can spare 4 men to escort you home. They can catch up to us later in Grand Island." The arrangements were quickly made. Wheeler selected 4 of his most experienced hands, tough, capable men who knew how to handle trouble without seeking it out. By mid-afternoon, they were on their way, the wagon now accompanied by 4 mounted cowboys who ranged ahead and behind like sentries. The journey home took longer than their trip to town had, the wagon heavy with supplies and their pace more cautious given the potential for ambush. They camped one night on the trail, the cowboys taking turns standing watch while Eliza and Zach slept in the wagon. It was mid-morning of the second day when they finally crested the rise that overlooked the Collins homestead. Eliza's heart clenched at the sight her home, still standing, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. "Someone's there," Zach observed, tension evident in his voice. "Stay back with the men, I'll ride ahead and see who it is." Before he could spur his horse forward, one of the cowboys, a sharp-eyed man named Rodriguez, pointed to the north. "Riders coming," he warned, 3 of them moving fast. Eliza followed his gesture and felt her blood run cold. Even at this distance, she recognized the lead rider, Jed Maxwell, with his sons close behind. "Looks like we're all arriving at the same time," Zach said grimly, reaching for his rifle. "Mrs. Wilson must have told them we'd gone to town. What do we do?" Eliza asked, fear and determination warring within her. Zach exchanged glances with the cowboys who had already spread out in a defensive formation around the wagon. "We go home," he said simply, "and we make it clear that this land is ours." With Zach riding beside the wagon and the cowboys flanking them, they continued down the slope toward the homestead. As they drew closer, the figure by the cabin came into view, Mrs. Wilson, who had apparently come to check on the property in their absence. The 2 groups converged in the yard, Eliza and Zach with their escort from one direction, the Maxwells from the other, with Mrs. Wilson standing uncertainly by the cabin door. "Well, well," Jed Maxwell called as he reined his horse to a stop. "The widow Collins returns, and with company, I see." "I'm not a widow, Mr. Maxwell," Eliza replied calmly, drawing strength from Zach's presence beside her. "And this is still my land." Maxwell's cold eyes moved to the cowboys, who had positioned themselves strategically around the yard. "Hired guns won't help you, woman. This territory belongs to those strong enough to hold it." "Funny," Zach said, his voice deceptively casual. "The land office in Cottonwood Springs seems to think it belongs to Mrs. Collins, and so does Sheriff Miller." A muscle twitched in Maxwell's jaw. "Land office clerks and sheriffs come and go, people like us." He gestured between himself and Zach. "We understand the real law out here." "And what law is that?" Zach asked, though his hand remained near his holstered pistol. "Survival," Maxwell replied bluntly. "This land can't support a woman alone. You know it, I know it. Even her husband knew it, which is why he left." "She's not alone," Zach stated firmly. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "For now, but winter's coming, cowboy. You planning to stick around when the snow's 6 feet deep and food's running scarce? When the wolves are howling at the door and this land feels like the loneliest place on God's earth?" "I am," Zach confirmed, his voice carrying such certainty that Eliza felt her heart swell. Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, a calculation, a reassessment. His gaze moved from Zach to the Cowboys, clearly counting odds. "Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot," he said finally, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "I was merely expressing concern for a neighbor's welfare. If Mrs. Collins has found assistance, then I'm pleased for her." The abrupt change in tactics was transparent, but Eliza recognized it for what it was: a strategic retreat, not a surrender. "Your concern is noted, Mr. Maxwell," she replied coolly, "but unnecessary. Now, if you don't mind, we've had a long journey and would like to get settled." For a moment, it seemed Maxwell might object, might push the confrontation further, but then he nodded, a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, we'll be on our way. But remember, neighbors should look out for each other in these parts. My offer of protection stands." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his sons following suit, and they galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Eliza release the breath she'd been holding. Beside her, Zach's posture remained tense, his eyes tracking the Maxwells until they were gone. "That was too easy," he muttered. "They're planning something." One of the Cowboys, an older man with a weathered face named Jenkins, nodded in agreement. "Men like that don't give up what they want without a fight. Then we'll be ready when they come back," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. Mrs. Wilson approached from the cabin, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Thank goodness you're back," she exclaimed. "Those men have been prowling around the property for days. I came by to check on things this morning and was about to leave when I saw you all coming." "Thank you for watching over the place," Eliza said warmly, embracing the older woman. "And for taking care of our animals. Speaking of which," Mrs. Wilson replied, "your cow's back in the barn and the chickens are all accounted for, but there's something else you should know." She lowered her voice. "Your husband was here yesterday asking questions about you and Mr. Hayes." Eliza felt Zach stiffen beside her. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "Wanted to know if you two were." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sharing the cabin. Said he had a right to know what was happening on his property." "And what did you tell him?" Eliza asked, though she could guess the answer. Mrs. Wilson lifted her chin. "I told him that what happens between a woman and a man who treats her with respect is none of his business, especially after he rode off and left her to fend for herself." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Eliza couldn't help a small smile at the older woman's loyalty. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." After seeing Mrs. Wilson safely on her way home with one of the Cowboys as an escort, Eliza and Zach settled back into the homestead. The remaining Cowboys made camp near the barn, their presence a reassuring deterrent against immediate trouble. That evening, as Eliza prepared dinner for their protectors, Zach outlined his concerns. "Maxwell and Thomas are working together," he said, keeping his voice low so the men outside wouldn't hear. "Thomas probably told them we'd gone to town, hoping they'd take advantage of our absence." "But why would Thomas help them?" Eliza asked, puzzled. "If they take our land, he gets nothing." "Spite," Zach replied simply. "He can't stand that you're managing without him, especially with another man's help. And maybe Maxwell promised him a cut of whatever they can get for the land once they run us off." The logic was depressingly sound. Thomas's pride had always been his driving force, often outweighing practical considerations. "So what do we do?" Eliza asked, setting down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables. Zach's expression was grim but determined. "We prepare. The Cowboys can stay a few days, but eventually they'll need to rejoin their drive. Before they go, we'll strengthen our defenses, reinforce the doors and windows, establish clear lines of sight around the property, set up an alarm system of sorts. And then we live our lives," Zach said, his expression softening as he stepped closer to her. "We work the land, prepare for winter, build something worth fighting for." He took her hands in his. "Together. The word held all the promise Eliza had ever wanted. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. Together, she agreed. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. With the cowboys' help, they transformed the homestead into a more defensible position, clearing brush that could provide cover for intruders, reinforcing doors and shutters, even digging a shallow trench around the perimeter that would slow anyone approaching on horseback. On the morning the cowboys were set to depart, their leader, Jenkins, pulled Zach aside for a private word. Eliza watched from the doorway as the two men conversed earnestly, Jenkins occasionally glancing her way. When Zach returned to her side, his expression was thoughtful. "Jenkins has offered to stay behind," he explained. "Says he's been thinking of settling down anyway and could use a place to winter before deciding where to put down roots." Eliza studied the older cowboy, who was now checking his saddle cinches with deliberate focus. "Can we trust him?" "With our lives," Zach assured her. "I've known men like Jenkins my whole career. His word is iron." The decision was made quickly. Jenkins would stay, providing an extra gun and set of hands as they prepared for winter and whatever the Maxwells might attempt. The other cowboys departed with promises to spread word about the situation to other cattle drives passing through the territory, ensuring that the Collins homestead would be a known quantity among the tight-knit community of trail hands. As October gave way to November, life settled into a new routine. Zach and Jenkins handled the heavier outdoor work, finishing the barn repairs, hunting for meat to smoke for winter, chopping endless cords of firewood. Eliza managed the household tasks, preserving the last of the garden's bounty and preparing for the long winter ahead. And through it all, her relationship with Zach deepened and evolved. Gone was the careful distance they'd maintained during their business arrangement. Now, stolen kisses while collecting eggs, hands finding each other as they worked side by side, and long conversations by the fire each evening wove them closer together. Jenkins, for his part, maintained a respectful distance from their growing intimacy, often finding reasons to check the barn or patrol the property perimeter in the evenings, giving them privacy without ever directly acknowledging the changing nature of their relationship. It was during one such evening, with Jenkins having excused himself to check on the horses despite having done so an hour earlier, that Zach finally broached the subject they'd been dancing around. "Eliza," he began, setting aside the harness he'd been mending. "There's something I need to ask you." She looked up from her sewing, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach at his serious tone. "Yes." Zach moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. "I know this isn't conventional. We've known each other less than 3 months. You're still legally married to another man. We're living under threat from people who want to take everything we have." Eliza's heart raced as she guessed where this was heading. "None of that matters," she said softly. Zach's smile was tender as he continued. "When I stopped at your homestead that day, I was just looking for water. Instead, I found a home. I found you." He took a deep breath. "I can't offer you legal marriage, not while Thomas lives, but I can offer you my heart, my hands, my strength, everything I am, for as long as I live." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming joy. "Zach, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm asking if you'll be my wife in every way that matters, legal papers or not, if you'll build a life with me, right here on this land that you've fought so hard to keep." The question hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity. Eliza didn't hesitate. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Zachary Hayes, I will be your wife in every way that matters." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the plains, brilliant and full of promise. Rising to his feet, he pulled her into his arms, sealing their commitment with a kiss that spoke of a future neither had dared to imagine just months before. Later that night, as they lay together in what was now truly their bed, Eliza traced the contours of Zach's face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Do you ever regret stopping here that day?" she asked. "Taking on all this trouble when you could have just continued on your way?" Zach caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Not for a single moment, he assured her. Some things are worth fighting for, this land, this life. His eyes held hers in the dim light. You. The first snow came a week later, fat flakes drifting from a leaden sky to dust the homestead in white. Eliza stood at the window, watching as Zach and Jenkins secured the last of the winter preparations, bringing in extra firewood, checking that the livestock had adequate shelter, ensuring the well was accessible even if drifts formed. There had been no sign of the Maxwells since their confrontation in the yard, nor any word of Thomas. The respite had allowed them to focus on winter preparations, but none of them believed the threat had passed. "They're waiting for something," Jenkins had commented the previous evening as they sat around the dinner table. "Men like Maxwell, they're patient when it suits them. Might be waiting for winter to really set in, thinking we'll be more vulnerable when we're snowed in." Zach had nodded in agreement. "Or they're trying to lull us into a false sense of security. Either way, we need to stay vigilant." Now, as Eliza watched the snow begin to accumulate, she felt a curious mixture of apprehension and peace. Winter on the frontier was always dangerous isolation, cold, the ever-present risk of running short on food or fuel. But for the first time since coming west, she didn't fear the season's challenges. With Zach by her side, she felt capable of facing whatever lay ahead. That evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a living thing, Jenkins cleared his throat awkwardly. "Been thinking," he said, setting aside his coffee cup. "With winter setting in, might be best if I moved to the lean-to behind the barn." Eliza looked up in surprise. "Don't be ridiculous, Jenkins. It's freezing out there." The older man's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Lean-to's plenty warm with the right preparations, and I reckon you two could use some privacy now that you've—" He gestured vaguely between them, clearly uncomfortable with naming their relationship directly. Zach and Eliza exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "We appreciate the thought, Jenkins," Zach said finally. "But with the Maxwells still out there, I'd feel better having you close by, at least until we're sure they've given up." Jenkins nodded, visibly relieved to have his offer declined while still making his point about their need for privacy. "Fair enough, but the offer stands." The conversation shifted to more practical matters: how long the current storm might last, whether they had enough preserved food to see them through until spring, the best way to keep the well from freezing over. It was a comfortable discussion, the kind that frontier families had been having for generations as they prepared to face the harshest season on the plains. Later, as Eliza lay in Zach's arms in their small bedroom, she felt a contentment she had never known with Thomas. Despite the dangers still lurking outside their door, despite the uncertain legal status of their relationship, she had found something precious and rare: a partnership of equals, built on respect and genuine affection. "What are you thinking about?" Zach murmured, his breath warm against her hair. "How strange life is," she replied softly. "A few months ago, I thought I'd lost everything when Thomas rode away. Now I realize I hadn't even found what truly mattered yet." Zach's arms tightened around her. "I've been thinking too," he admitted, "about spring, about our future." Eliza shifted to look up at him in the darkness. "What about it?" "I want to expand the homestead," he said, his voice taking on the quality it always did when he was planning something. "The southwest corner has good soil that hasn't been worked yet. Could double our crops next year. And I was thinking we might invest in a few head of cattle. Start small, but with good stock." The simple domestic planning warmed Eliza's heart more than any grand declaration of love could have. This was a man thinking of their future together, not just surviving the present crisis. "I'd like that," she said, resting her head on his chest. "And maybe we could add a room to the cabin, make it more of a proper home." "A proper home," Zach repeated, the words almost reverent in the quiet darkness. "Yes, that's exactly what we'll do." The winter days that followed fell into a rhythm: mornings spent on essential chores. afternoons dedicated to indoor tasks like mending equipment and preserving food, evenings passed in conversation or quiet companionship by the fire. The snow continued to fall intermittently, sometimes in gentle flurries, other times in raging blizzards that kept them confined to the cabin for days at a stretch. Through it all, the three inhabitants of the Collins homestead maintained their vigilance. Someone was always awake, keeping watch. The horses were checked regularly for signs of distress that might indicate intruders nearby. Weapons were kept loaded and within easy reach at all times. It was during one such blizzard, nearly a month after the first snowfall, that the confrontation they'd been expecting finally came. The day had dawned clear but bitterly cold, a brief respite between storms that Zach and Jenkins had used to check their trap lines and bring in more firewood. Eliza had taken advantage of the break in the weather to hang laundry in the cold sunshine, knowing it would freeze but that the wind would beat the moisture out of the fabric, making indoor drying by the fire faster later. She was just bringing in the last of the stiff, frozen sheets when she spotted movement at the edge of the clearing, three figures on horseback, nearly invisible against the snow-covered trees. Her heart stuttered in her chest as she recognized them immediately, the Maxwells, approaching with deliberate slowness, as if they had all the time in the world. "Zach," she called, trying to keep her voice calm despite the fear gripping her. "Jenkins." Both men emerged from the barn, instantly alert at her tone. Following her gaze, they spotted the approaching riders and moved quickly to her side, Jenkins already reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "Get inside," Zach instructed, his voice low and urgent. "Bar the door. Use the rifle through the window if you need to." But Eliza stood her ground, the frozen sheet still clutched in her hands. "No, this is my home too, I'm staying." There was no time to argue. The Maxwells had reached the edge of the yard, their horses moving carefully through the knee-deep snow. Jed Maxwell led the way, his cold eyes taking in the three figures standing before the cabin. "Afternoon, neighbors," he called, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Thought we'd check how you're faring with all this snow." "We're managing just fine," Zach replied, his tone making it clear that the social pretense wasn't fooling anyone. "What do you want, Maxwell?" The older man's false smile faded. "Straight to business then, I like that." He shifted in his saddle, revealing a rifle secured to his saddle horn. "We've come to make you a final offer for this land. $500 cash, more than fair, considering the circumstances." The circumstances being three armed men threatening a homestead in the middle of winter, Jenkins asked dryly. "Doesn't seem to improve the value from where I'm standing." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "The circumstances being that your claim to this land is, shall we say, compromised. Thomas Collins has signed papers relinquishing his share of the homestead to me. That makes me half owner already." Eliza felt her blood run cold. "That's not possible." "The land is registered in both our names." "Which is why I'm offering to buy your half," Maxwell replied smoothly. "Seems your husband needed money more than he needed land, or you." Zach's posture had tensed at the news, but his voice remained steady. "We checked with the land office just a few weeks ago. No transfer had been filed. Filed it yesterday," one of Maxwell's sons spoke up, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Road to town cleared just enough to get through if you're determined." The revelation hit Eliza like a physical blow. If Thomas had truly signed over his half of the claim to Maxwell, their legal position was suddenly much more precarious. She might still own her half of the homestead, but Maxwell would have equal rights to the property and all its improvements. Zach seemed to read her thoughts. "Even if what you say is true," he said to Maxwell, "Eliza still owns half this land, and she's not selling." "Oh, I think she will," Maxwell replied confidently. "Because her alternative is trying to run a homestead with me as her partner, and I guarantee I won't be as accommodating as you've been, Hayes." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable in its implication. Life would be unbearable if Maxwell gained even partial legal control of the property. $500, Maxwell repeated. Take it and go, start fresh somewhere else, away from all this trouble. It was a tempting offer, Eliza had to admit. $500 was enough to buy land elsewhere, perhaps even closer to a town where they'd have neighbors and protection. They could start over, free from the specter of Thomas and the Maxwells. But as she looked at the cabin behind her, the home she'd built with her own hands, the land she'd worked until her fingers bled, the future she and Zach had planned together, she knew she couldn't surrender it. Not like this. Not to men who used intimidation and deceit to take what wasn't rightfully theirs. No, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. This is my home, I won't be bullied off of it. Maxwell's expression darkened. Don't be a fool, woman, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Take the money while it's still offered. She's not outnumbered, Jenkins spoke up, his rifle now held casually but pointedly in his weathered hands. And as for outgunned, he smiled thinly. I've been shooting longer than you've been breathing, boy. For a tense moment, the tableau held 3 mounted men facing 3 determined defenders, the only sound the occasional snort of a horse and the distant call of a winter bird. Then Maxwell made a decision. Have it your way, he said coldly. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. He wheeled his horse around. You've got 1 week to reconsider. After that, the offer's withdrawn and you'll wish you'd taken it. With that final threat hanging in the frigid air, the Maxwells rode away, their horses struggling through the deep snow until they disappeared into the tree line. Only when they were completely out of sight did Eliza allow herself to react, her knees weakening as the tension of the confrontation released. Zach's arm came around her waist, steadying her. Let's get inside, he said quietly. We need to talk. In the warmth of the cabin, they gathered around the table, the frozen sheet forgotten by the door. Jenkins poured coffee for all of them, adding a splash of whiskey from a flask he produced from his vest pocket. Medicinal, he explained with a wink that didn't quite mask his concern. Figured we could all use it. Eliza took a grateful sip, the liquid burning a path down her throat and settling warmly in her stomach. Do you think he was telling the truth about Thomas signing over his share? Zach's expression was grim. It's possible Thomas was angry when we saw him in town. And Maxwell would have offered him money, maybe not much, but enough to make it tempting. But would it be legal? Eliza pressed. Can Thomas sell his share without my consent? Jenkins, who had been quietly sipping his spiked coffee, set down his cup. Depends on how the original claim was filed, he said thoughtfully. If it was registered as tenants in common, then yes, he could sell his half without your permission. If it was joint tenancy, he shrugged. Then it's more complicated. Eliza tried to remember the paperwork they'd signed 7 years earlier when they'd first staked their claim. It had been a blur of forms and legal language, with Thomas handling most of the details while she focused on setting up their first crude shelter. I don't know, she admitted finally. Thomas handled all the legal matters. Then we have to assume the worst, Zach said practically. If Maxwell believes he has legal standing, he'll press that advantage, and given what we know of him, he won't be content with just owning half the property. He'll try to force us out, Jenkins agreed. Make life so difficult that selling becomes the only viable option. Eliza looked between the 2 men, drawing strength from their steady presence. So what do we do? Zach considered the question carefully. First, we need to verify Maxwell's claim. As soon as the weather allows, one of us needs to ride to town and check with the land office. And if it's true, if Thomas really did sell his share to Maxwell, then we have some hard decisions to make, Zach acknowledged. But whatever we decide, we do it together. The promise warmed Eliza more than the coffee and whiskey combined. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The week that followed was tense, each day bringing them closer to Maxwell's deadline while the continuing snow made travel to town impossible. They used the time to prepare for various contingencies, securing valuables that could be quickly packed if they needed to leave, discussing potential legal strategies if Maxwell did indeed now own half the property. even scouting defensive positions around the homestead in case the situation turned violent. Through it all, Eliza was sustained by Zach's unwavering support and Jenkins's quiet strength. Neither man suggested that she should accept Maxwell's offer and leave her home behind. Both treated her as an equal partner in the decisions that would shape their future. It was a stark contrast to her life with Thomas, who had made all important decisions unilaterally, often dismissing her concerns or suggestions without consideration. Now, sitting around the table each evening discussing strategies and options, Eliza realized how much she'd changed in the months since Thomas rode away. She was no longer the quiet, acquiescent wife who deferred to her husband's judgment. She had found her voice, her strength, her own sense of what mattered and what she was willing to fight for. On the 6th day after Maxwell's ultimatum, the snow finally stopped, and a pale winter sun emerged to create a glittering landscape outside their windows. The temperature remained bitterly cold, but the clear sky offered their first opportunity to reach town in weeks. "I'll go," Zach decided after they'd discussed the matter over breakfast. "Jenkins should stay here with you just in case Maxwell decides to come back early." Eliza nodded, though the thought of Zach traveling alone worried her. "How long will it take in this snow?" "Longer than usual," he admitted. "Probably can't make it there and back in a single day. I'll need to stay overnight in town." The prospect of being separated, even briefly, filled Eliza with dread. But she knew there was no alternative. They needed information from the land office before Maxwell's deadline expired. "Be careful," she said simply, reaching across the table to take his hand. Zach's fingers tightened around hers. "Always am." Preparations for his journey were made quickly, warm clothes layered against the cold, provisions packed, his most reliable horse saddled and ready. As he prepared to depart, he pulled Eliza aside for a moment of privacy. "If I'm not back by tomorrow night," he said quietly, "don't wait for Maxwell to return. Take Jenkins and head for the Wilson farm. Stay there until you hear from me." Eliza wanted to protest, to insist that she would wait for him no matter what, but she recognized the wisdom in his instructions. "I will," she promised, "but you'll be back." His smile was warm despite the worry in his eyes. "Count on it." He kissed her then, a lingering embrace that held all the words they couldn't speak aloud. And then he was gone, riding away through the snow-covered landscape until he disappeared over the eastern ridge. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Eliza kept herself busy with chores, but her mind constantly returned to Zach, wondering where he was, if he was safe, what news he might bring back from town. Jenkins, sensing her anxiety, kept a steady stream of conversation flowing, sharing stories from his years on the trail that were by turns harrowing, humorous, and heartwarming. As dusk approached with no sign of Zach's return, Eliza reminded herself that he had expected to stay overnight in town. There was no reason to worry yet. Still, she found herself repeatedly drawn to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. It was during one such vigil that she spotted them, not Zach returning from the east, but 3 riders approaching from the north. The Maxwells, a day earlier than their stated deadline. "Jenkins," she called, her voice steady despite the fear clenching her stomach. "They're back." The older man was at her side in an instant, his expression grim as he assessed the approaching riders. "Damn," he muttered. "Was hoping Hayes would be back before they showed up again." "What do we do?" Eliza asked, already reaching for her rifle. Jenkins considered their options quickly. "They'll have seen the tracks Zach left this morning. They'll know one of us is gone." He made a decision. "We stand our ground. Make it clear we're not intimidated." Together, they stepped out onto the porch, rifles in hand but not raised, as the Maxwells approached the yard. The setting sun cast long shadows across the snow, lending an eerie quality to the scene. "Evening, Mrs. Collins," Maxwell called as they drew near. "Seems you're short a man today." "Mr. Hayes had business in town," Eliza replied evenly. "He'll be back shortly." Maxwell's smile was cold, Town, is it? Checking on my claim to this land, I expect. Something like that, Jenkins confirmed, his posture deceptively relaxed despite the tension in the air. Maxwell dismounted, signaling for his sons to remain on their horses. Well, I hate to disappoint him, but the transfer is all legal and proper. Thomas Collins signed over his half of the claim to me in exchange for a sum we both found satisfactory. He removed a folded document from his coat pocket. Got the paperwork right here if you'd care to see it. Eliza stepped forward, accepting the document with a steady hand. The legal language was dense and formal, but the signatures at the bottom were clear enough Thomas's familiar scrawl alongside a notary's official stamp. As you can see, Maxwell continued as she read, I'm now legal owner of a half interest in this homestead. Which means we have some arrangements to discuss. Eliza handed the document back, her mind racing. Mr. Maxwell, regardless of whatever arrangement you made with my husband, this property is my home. I have no intention of selling my share or leaving. Maxwell's false congeniality slipped, revealing the hardness beneath. That's not how this works, Mrs. Collins. A property this size can't be efficiently managed by two separate parties with different interests. The law recognizes that. It's called partition by sale, meaning. Jenkins asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Meaning that when co-owners can't agree on the use of a property, the court can order it sold and the proceeds divided, Maxwell explained with evident satisfaction. I've already filed the petition in the territorial court. Hearings set for spring thaw. The news hit Eliza like a physical blow. She had been prepared for Maxwell to claim partial ownership, but not for this legal maneuver that could force the sale of her home regardless of her wishes. That's months away, she pointed out, fighting to maintain her composure. Until then, this land is still half mine and I have every right to remain here. True enough, Maxwell conceded, but as your new partner, I'll be taking an active interest in the property. Starting tomorrow, my sons and I will be moving into the barn. Need to be on site to protect our investment, you understand. The implication was clear. They intended to make life unbearable, to harass and intimidate until Eliza and Zach gave up and left voluntarily, rather than endure months of living alongside their tormentors. The barn belongs to the homestead, Jenkins spoke up. And half the homestead belongs to Mrs. Collins. You can't just move in without her consent. Maxwell's eyes hardened. Watch me, old man. The law's on my side now. Interfere and you'll find yourself on the wrong side of a judge come spring. Before either Eliza or Jenkins could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught their attention. All eyes turned to the eastern ridge, where a lone rider was visible against the darkening sky. Zach had returned. Relief flooded through Eliza, followed immediately by concern. Zach was riding hard, pushing his horse through the deep snow with an urgency that suggested important news. Maxwell and his sons watched the approaching rider with evident displeasure. Their plan to confront Eliza while Zach was away had been thwarted by his unexpected early return. Zach reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, taking in the scene with a quick, assessing glance. Maxwell, he acknowledged coolly, dismounting with fluid grace despite what must have been an exhausting journey. You're early. Hayes, Maxwell returned, equally cold. Just sharing some legal developments with your landlady. He emphasized the word with deliberate insult. I'm now half owner of this property with a partition action pending in territorial court. Zach moved to stand beside Eliza, his presence steady and reassuring. Is that so? He asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't particularly impressed by this news. Maxwell's eyes narrowed at Zach's apparent lack of concern. It is. And until the court orders the sale of the property, my sons and I will be taking up residence in the barn, as is our right as co-owners. To everyone's surprise, Zach smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, but one that held knowledge and satisfaction. Actually, he said conversationally, I have some legal developments of my own to share. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document similar to the one Maxwell had shown earlier. I spoke with Judge Patterson in town today. Seems he remembers Thomas Collins quite well, particularly his fondness for gambling and whiskey. Maxwell's expression remained impassive, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "What's your point?" "My point," Zach continued, unfolding the document, "is that the judge was very interested to hear how Thomas suddenly had a legal interest in a homestead to sell, given that he'd already lost his share in a poker game 3 months ago." The revelation hung in the frigid air like a physical presence. Eliza stared at Zach in shock. "What?" Zach's eyes met hers briefly, apologetic yet resolute. "I didn't want to tell you until I had proof, but when Thomas left, it wasn't just because he thought you were a burden. It was because he no longer had any legal claim to this land. He'd gambled it away the night before." He handed the document to Eliza. Unlike Maxwell's paper with its formal legal language, this was a simple but binding bill of sale, written in a clear hand and signed by both Thomas Collins and Judge Patterson himself, dated the day before Thomas had abandoned her. "Thomas lost his half of the homestead to the judge in a poker game," Zach explained for everyone's benefit. "He rode away the next day rather than face you with the truth, Eliza." But then, Eliza looked up from the document, understanding dawning. If Thomas had already sold his share to Judge Patterson, then he had nothing to sell to Maxwell, Zach confirmed, turning to face the older man. "Your bill of sale is worthless, Maxwell. Thomas Collins sold you something he no longer owned." Maxwell's face had darkened to a dangerous shade of red. "You're lying," he spat. "This is a trick." "No trick," Zach replied calmly. "Judge Patterson was quite surprised to hear that Thomas was still claiming ownership of half this homestead. He's filing fraud charges as we speak." The standoff that followed was brief but intense. Maxwell, realizing his scheme had collapsed, made one final threat. "This isn't over, Hayes, not by a long shot." "Actually, it is," came a new voice from behind them. All eyes turned to see Sheriff Miller riding into the yard, accompanied by 2 deputies. The lawman looked weary from the journey but satisfied as he surveyed the scene. "Jed Maxwell," he announced formally. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit property theft." He nodded toward Zach. Mr. Hayes here was quite persuasive about the need for immediate action. Judge Patterson agreed. The color drained from Maxwell's face as the implications sank in. His sons looked to him for direction, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Don't," Sheriff Miller warned, noting the movement. "You boys are named in the warrant too. Come peacefully and the judge might be lenient. Resist and you'll hang." For a moment, it seemed Maxwell might indeed choose resistance. But then, with a resigned slump of his shoulders, he raised his hands in surrender. His sons, following his example, did the same. As the sheriff and his deputies took the Maxwells into custody, Eliza turned to Zach, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering shock. "Thomas gambled away his half of our land?" she asked, still struggling to process this new information. Zach nodded, his expression apologetic. "I suspected something like that when you mentioned how suddenly he left. Men don't usually abandon years of work without a compelling reason. When I got to town, I asked around and learned that Thomas had been in a high-stakes poker game the night before he rode out." "So who owns the other half of our homestead now?" Eliza asked, her mind spinning with the implications. "Judge Patterson," Zach's smile returned, warming his features. "Not anymore." He reached into his coat once more, producing a 3rd document. The judge was quite happy to sell Thomas's former share to an interested buyer, said he had no use for frontier property at his age. Eliza accepted the paper with trembling hands. It was a deed of sale, transferring ownership of 1/2 interest in the Collins homestead from Judge Horace Patterson to Zachary Hayes. "You bought it," she whispered, looking up at him in wonder. "But how? Where did you get the money?" Zach's expression turned slightly sheepish. Remember that cattle drive I was heading to California to join? The trail boss was an old friend who owed me back wages from 3 seasons. I've been carrying his note for years, never having much need for the money. Judge Patterson was happy to accept it as payment. The full implications of what Zach had done washed over Eliza. He had spent his life savings to secure her home, to ensure that no one could ever again threaten her right to remain on the land she loved. So now, she began, hardly daring to believe it. "Now the homestead belongs to us," Zach confirmed, his voice soft with meaning. "Half to you, half to me, partners in every sense." Eliza felt tears welling in her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming joy and gratitude. Without words, she stepped into Zach's embrace, burying her face against his chest as his arms came around her, strong and secure over her head. Zach exchanged a glance with Jenkins, who was discreetly wiping moisture from his own weathered cheek. The older man nodded once, a gesture of approval and respect, before turning to assist the sheriff with securing the prisoners for the journey back to town. As the lawmen prepared to depart with their charges, Sheriff Miller approached Eliza and Zach, who still stood locked in their embrace. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone respectful. "Judge Patterson asked me to convey his apologies for not informing you immediately when he acquired Thomas's share of the property. He felt it might be distressing, given the circumstances." Eliza stepped back from Zach, though she kept hold of his hand. "I understand," she replied, finding that she truly did. The judge had shown more consideration than Thomas ever had. "The judge also wanted me to let you know that the fraud charges against Thomas Collins have been filed," the sheriff continued, "if you have any information on his whereabouts." Eliza shook her head. "I haven't seen or heard from him since we encountered him in town months ago," the sheriff nodded, unsurprised. "Well, he won't get far. Word's been sent to every settlement in the territory. He'll be found eventually." He tipped his hat. "We'll be on our way now." Wanted to get a few miles in before full dark. As the sheriff's party departed, taking the sullen Maxwells with them, a profound silence settled over the homestead. The threat that had hung over them for months had been neutralized, leaving a curious vacuum in its wake. Jenkins was the first to break the spell. "Well," he said pragmatically, "that horse of yours needs tending, Hayes, and I reckon we could all use some dinner after all this excitement." The simple domestic concerns were a welcome return to normalcy. Zach went to care for his exhausted mount, while Eliza and Jenkins headed inside to prepare a meal. By the time Zach joined them, stamping snow from his boots at the door, the cabin was filled with the enticing aroma of rabbit stew and fresh biscuits. They ate with the hearty appetite of people who have survived a crisis, the conversation flowing easily between them. Jenkins shared amusing observations about the Maxwells' expressions when the sheriff arrived, while Zach recounted details of his journey to town and his conversations with Judge Patterson. It was only after the meal was finished, and Jenkins had excused himself to check on the livestock, that Eliza and Zach found themselves truly alone for the first time since his return. "I still can't believe you did this," Eliza said softly, tracing the edge of the deed that now lay on the table between them. "You spent everything you had to buy half a struggling homestead in the middle of nowhere." Zach covered her hand with his own. "Not nowhere," he corrected gently. "Home." "Our home," he smiled, the familiar dimple appearing in his cheek. "Besides, it's a good investment. With both of us working the land, this place will thrive." Eliza returned his smile, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Is that what we're doing, investing?" "Among other things," Zach replied, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone as he leaned closer. "I told you once that I couldn't offer you legal marriage while Thomas lived, but I can offer you a true partnership in this land, in this life, in everything that matters." "Yes," Eliza whispered, leaning forward to meet him halfway. "Everything that matters." Their kiss sealed a promise more binding than any legal document, a commitment to build a future together on the foundation they'd already created. When Jenkins returned from the barn sometime later, he found them still sitting at the table, heads bent close together as they discussed plans for spring planting and a new room for the cabin. He cleared his throat to announce his presence, though his smile indicated he wasn't particularly concerned about interrupting. "Been thinking," he said, settling into his usual chair by the fire. "With all this excitement behind us, might be time for me to move on. Spring cattle drives will be starting up in a couple months." Eliza looked up in surprise. "You're leaving?" Jenkins shrugged, his weathered face creasing in a knowing smile. "Seems to me you two might appreciate having the place to yourselves, and I've got that restless feeling again." "Trail's calling." Zach studied the older man thoughtfully. "You're always welcome here, Jenkins, you know that. And I appreciate it," Jenkins replied sincerely. "But a man knows when he's become a third wheel." He winked at Eliza, who felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "Besides, I've got some ideas about that cattle ranch you were talking about starting. Might be able to point you towards some good stock when the time comes." The discussion turned to practical matters: when Jenkins might leave, which cattle breeds would be best suited to the Nebraska climate, how many head they could reasonably manage alongside their existing farm work. Through it all, Eliza felt a sense of contentment she'd never experienced before. This was what a true home felt like: not just a place, but people who genuinely cared for each other, planning a shared future with excitement and hope. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, life at the Collins-Hayes homestead settled into a new rhythm. Jenkins remained through February, helping with repairs and improvements to prepare for spring. When he finally departed in early March, it was with promises to return in the fall with cattle from Texas that would form the nucleus of their new herd. Alone at last, Eliza and Zach embraced their partnership fully. They worked side by side during the day, planting fields that had lain fallow under Thomas's neglectful management, repairing fences, and adding the new room to the cabin that they'd planned during the long winter evenings. At night, they shared their dreams and plans, their hopes and occasional fears, weaving their separate lives into a single, stronger whole. News reached them occasionally from town: the Maxwells had been convicted of fraud and intimidation, sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison. Thomas had been apprehended trying to cross into Wyoming territory and now faced his own fraud charges. Judge Patterson had formalized the legal record of their homestead ownership, ensuring that no future challenges could threaten their claim. But these external events seemed increasingly distant and unimportant compared to the life they were building together. The homestead was transforming under their joint care: the garden expanded and flourishing, the fields planted with wheat and corn, the chicken flock increased, and preparations underway for the cattle that would arrive in the fall. On a warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zach took Eliza's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd come to recognize as his planning voice. "Dangerous," she teased, leaning against his shoulder. He chuckled, squeezing her hand gently. "Maybe, but hear me out. I was thinking about names." Eliza looked up at him, curiosity piqued. "Names for the ranch," he clarified. "If we're going to be raising cattle alongside the farming, we should have a proper name for the place." The idea had never occurred to Eliza. Under Thomas, the homestead had simply been the Collins place to neighbors and travelers. But Zach was right: with their expanded ambitions, a formal name seemed appropriate. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Zach's expression turned slightly self-conscious. "Well, I was thinking, Sunrise Ranch." "Sunrise," Eliza repeated, considering the suggestion. Zach nodded, his eyes on the fading light in the western sky. "Because that's what you've been for me, Eliza. A new day, a fresh start. The promise that no matter how dark the night, morning always comes." The simple poetry of his words brought tears to Eliza's eyes. She had never thought of herself that way: as a beacon, a source of light and hope, but through Zach's eyes she could almost see it. Sunrise Ranch, she said softly, testing the name on her tongue. I like it. His smile was warm in the gathering dusk. Then it settled. As darkness fell around them, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Thomas's cruel abandonment, once the most painful experience of her life, now seemed like a necessary catalyst for something infinitely more precious. If he hadn't called her a burden and ridden away that summer day, she might never have known what true partnership could be. Sometimes, she realized, what feels like an ending is merely the beginning of a better story. And here, with Zach beside her and their future stretching before them like the vast Nebraska sky, Eliza knew their story was just beginning. In the years that followed, Sunrise Ranch grew and prospered. The cattle Jenkins brought from Texas flourished on the rich grassland, and each season saw new calves added to the growing herd. The fields produced abundant harvests, providing not just for their own needs but surplus to sell in Cottonwood Springs, which was itself growing into a proper town as the railroad expanded westward. They added more rooms to the cabin until it became a proper house, with a stone fireplace and glass windows ordered all the way from Chicago. Jenkins visited each fall, bringing news from his travels and occasionally staying through winter before the restlessness of the trail called him away again. Word of Thomas's death reached them in the third year, killed in a bar fight in some mining town in Colorado Territory. The news affected Eliza less than she might have expected. The man who had abandoned her had become a stranger long before his passing, someone from another life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing season. Life on the frontier remained challenging: droughts, blizzards, occasional troubles with rustlers or dishonest cattle buyers. But through it all, Eliza and Zach faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. And on a crisp autumn morning in their 5th year at Sunrise Ranch, as they stood together watching the dawn light spill across their land, Eliza reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by what had once seemed like her greatest tragedy. "What are you thinking about?" Zach asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Eliza smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us exactly where we need to be." She looked up at him, her heart full. "About how grateful I am that my husband called me a burden and rode off, because it meant you could cook me breakfast and stay." Zach's laugh was warm in the morning air as he pulled her closer. "Best decision I ever made," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And one I'd make again every day for the rest of my life." Together, they turned toward the house, their home, as the sun climbed higher, promising another day of the life they'd built together at Sunrise Ranch.